Rita.
Olá a todos, boa tarde, bem-vindos à Flad. Hi, hello everyone, welcome to Flad. It's a pleasure to have you here on another session of Meet the Author, this time with Nathan Thrall, which will tell us a different story, but that is one of the good things about this program, Meet the Author, is that each time we have a different author and a different story. And we have, as always, Isabel Lucas with us to conduct the conversation, and so I would like to pass the floor. Thank you, both of you, for being here, and I would like to pass the floor to you too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigada, Rita. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Nathan, for being here in Lisbon to talk about your book. I'll start to present Nathan. Nathan is a journalist, an essayist, has lived in Jerusalem for 12 years, where he wrote for publications such as the New York Review of Books, where he published the report A Day in the Life of Abed Salama. It's the book that we have here. That article was transformed in a book. Is about one accident in one morning, February 2011. Milad, the 5-year-old son of Abed Salama, a Palestinian from Jerusalem, set off for a school trip under a heavy storm. A few hours later, after passing a checkpoint, the school bus crashes into an 18-wheeler truck coming from a settlement. The bus flips over and catches fire. 10 people die, including 8 children. There's no bomb, no attack, just a tragedy that could have happened anywhere in the world, but here it highlights a daily life marked by tensions, disputes, differences, the domination of one community over another. This is Thrall's second book, the first, published in 2017, The Only Language They Understand, is an analysis of all the attempts at agreements between Israel and Palestine. What they have in common in these two books is the language of violence, an obstacle to any kind of understanding. Nathan, I would like you to, first of all, read a passage from this book.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you all for coming.
That's it. That is the original one?
Yes, this is the US version, and there's a different cover, a UK version. So I'm going to read a passage. I'm going to read a passage from the scene of the crash, where a Palestinian doctor by the name of Huda is on her way to work. She works for the UN refugee agency, UNRWA, and she is on the way with her medical team to a Bedouin community called Khan al-Ahmar. And she happens upon this burning bus filled with kindergartners. And she gets out of this van that she's riding in with her team and helps to rescue kindergartners, children, from this bus. There's another person who's mentioned in this passage whose name is Salim. And he is another bystander who lived just near the road where this accident took place. And he had heroically entered this burning bus. Most of the other people were trying to help from the outside, but he repeatedly entered, crawled into this bus, and was pulling children or pushing children out. And he, together with a teacher by the name of Ula, were the two who entered the bus and actually pulled children out. So those are the names to keep in mind. Nearly 20 minutes had passed since Huda and her staff had come upon the burning bus. Flames and smoke were still pouring from the smashed windows. Huda's driver, Abu Faraj, was directing traffic, keeping an open path for the evacuees and telling drivers of oncoming cars to turn back. The crowd had grown so large that Huda could no longer see the driver and the teacher she and Salam had pulled from the front of the bus. She was focused on the children, gently carrying them with one of the UN nurses to the cars that had stopped at the accident site. Many of the drivers had volunteered to transport the burn victims and stood ready to race to the nearest accessible hospital, which, for most of them, was in Ramallah. The hospitals in Jerusalem were far better, but only those with blue IDs could reach them. A few of the drivers did have blue IDs, and some took off in the direction of Hadassah Hospital at Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. The majority, those with green IDs, went in the opposite direction, along the flooded road to Ramallah. Nearly all the children had been brought off the bus when Salim, who had by now gone in and out of the flames several times, saw that Ula, the teacher and his partner in the rescue, was trapped beneath a front seat and her leg was burning. But by the time he got to her, it was too late. She was gone. He carried Ula from the bus and placed her on the ground. Her nephew, Sadi, watched in the rain while a man covered her with his coat. In all of this, Salim had felt nothing, not even as someone in the crowd grabbed at his arm and pinched him. One of Huda's nurses yelled to him that his jacket was on fire. He shouted back that it was not. The nurse put it out as he went to climb back into the bus. The few children still inside were no longer alive. The last boy Salim pulled out was facing down, crouched behind the frame of a seat. He was still wearing a backpack, which Salim held to pick the boy up. Stepping out of the bus for the final time, Salim broke out weeping, shouting that he should have saved more. Somehow, not a hair on his head was burned. Abu Faraj stood unmoving, in shock, as if mesmerized by the flames. Huda turned to the nurse beside her and saw that her face was black and streaked by rain. She realized she must look the same. They were soaked and bone-weary, and there was nothing more for them to do. When a Palestinian ambulance finally arrived, most of the injured children had already been evacuated. Huda didn't even notice it. The bus was still crackling with flames, and there was much shouting and commotion. Not a single firefighter, police officer, or soldier had come. Huda wanted to follow the children. She found her team, and they returned to the UNRWA van. Nida, the pregnant pharmacist, was still inside, inconsolable. Abu Faraj started dropping off everyone at home, as Huda called around and confirmed that most of the children were in Ramallah. Then she phoned her UNRWA supervisor. He didn't understand the magnitude of the accident and demanded that the team turn around and go to Khan al-Ahmar, or he would cut their pay. Huda refused and said he should cut just her salary, no one else's. After stopping for a quick shower, Huda set off for the hospital, taking the clinic's social worker with her. When they got there, word spread that Huda had been at the crash. A great many parents and other relatives sought her out, asking whether she had seen a boy with a Spider-Man backpack, a girl with her hair in yellow ribbons. Huda told them all the same thing. The children had been covered in soot, and she couldn't tell what they were wearing. Going from room to room, Huda checked on the injured children, soothing them. Since leaving the bus, she had felt something nagging at her. She was sure the kindergartners had been silent, at least early in their ordeal. Now, at the bed of one girl, Huda asked her why that was, why she had heard no sound. "We were so scared," the girl said. "When we saw the flames, we thought we had died. We thought we were in hell."
Thank you. This book have this version in Portuguese, Dia na Vida de Abed Salama. The label is Zigurat, and it was translated by Sara Veiga, that is there, well translated. And in a conversation that we have a few weeks ago for Público newspaper, you mentioned, you used an expression, absurd insanity to describe what happened in that territory before October the 7th. Now this absurd insanity, there is any expression to express what is passing after this October 7.
Yeah. The just the landscape of the city of Jerusalem, of the West Bank, of Gaza, of Israel, is an insane landscape of fences and walls and segregation. And part of what I aimed to do in the book was to explain how the system works, why it works in this way, why the wall was routed in the way that it was, why Gaza is enclosed, why the community that the parents and children in this accident live in, why it is in an enclosed, walled ghetto, not unlike Gaza, this one with 130,000 people in it today, who are living just underneath, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, from the grounds of which you can look down and see this walled ghetto with no sidewalks, playgrounds, a checkpoint on each end enclosing it, a segregated road running alongside part of it. And so, the deep theme of the book was not just the story of the accident and the lives of these people, but also the structure in which they live and what it means for something like this, an event that takes place all over the world, an accident with a bus, what it means for it to take place in this particular place with these sets of rules and restrictions on different parts of the population behind this wall.
And how did you get to this story? And you have this idea or this perception, this intuition that this story could help you to tell all this complexity that is involved in that territory, as you said.
So before I came on the story of the accident, I was interested in just the idea of taking a single event to tell the whole story of Israel-Palestine. I had the ambition to do something that was much more narrative, and I felt, in a way, the obligation to do it because I felt that the world had become numb to Israel-Palestine. It's crazy to hear those words now because it's on the front page of every newspaper. But that attention is short-lived. It happens when there's a war in Gaza. We saw it in 2014 with that war. We saw it in 2021 with that war. And then it's gone. And I wanted to, first of all, break through that numbness. And the way to do that was to tell a much tighter story of a day, but a day that shows an entire more than 100-year conflict. And also to choose a dramatic event, but not one that could be exceptionalized, that could be treated as some other instance. Really an ordinary event. That was the main goal behind just having the idea of doing something like this. The truth is that I don't think it had to be this accident that I would tell the story of Israel-Palestine through. I think that if you were to, take a dart and throw it at a map of Israel-Palestine, if you dig in any place, you can unearth the whole story of the place. It's small, and all of these things that I describe are happening everywhere in slightly different ways. That said, I live in Jerusalem, and these parents and these children share the same city with me, and they live a radically different existence on the other side of this wall. And I even learned as I was investigating this particular accident that someone very close to my family, a very close family friend, she was distantly related to Abed Salama. And I hadn't met Abed yet, and she put me in touch with her closer relative who put me in touch with Abed. And I came and I met Abed, and he bestowed this incredible trust in me and shared the most intimate details, not just of the accident, but really of his whole life. And with Abed, I spent the most time, and he occupies...
How many time you spent?
I mean, I've spent most of the last few years with Abed. He and I were traveling together at the beginning of this book tour. He and I were doing events together in the UK and in the US. He had to cut it short because of the situation in the West Bank now is reminiscent of the Second Intifada, with towns shut down and tremendous difficulty in terms of movement, loss of jobs, increased violence, settler attacks. So Abed had to leave, but he, like other parents, really opened up to me because he had a hunger to talk about his son and to talk about this event. And no one around him wanted to talk about it. Everyone was afraid to talk about it in front of him, and particularly in front of his wife, who also doesn't want to talk about it. And I found time and again with different parents whom I spoke to about the accident that they were yearning to talk about the event.
And they trust you, an American journalist, I don't know, a Jew,
Yeah.
that lived in the other side of the wall.
Yes.
It was difficult to gain his confidence, his trust.
It really wasn't.
No.
He really kind of trusted me immediately. I don't have a great explanation for why that is. When we were doing the book talks together, that was a question he was often asked in slightly more and less insulting ways to me. And he said, I saw tears in his eyes when I told him the story.
Yeah. The story is told, I guess it was my perception that it is told as you were, is narrated as you were narrating a novel. But these are real people, these are a real landscape, these are real facts. And you, in your other book, you talked about the language of violence that's in everywhere in this place. How did you deal with this way of telling the story, and how did you choose the language not to, I don't know, escape to that language of violence, or trying to be neutral here as you were as a journalist, as you are telling a story that is, as you said, very emotional. You are dealing with the traumas and fears and that are very old. How did you balance all these challenges?
So there are two different kinds of challenges that you're describing, and one with respect to the emotions and the dehumanization and the violence. With that, I felt that the facts of the story are so powerful that the most effective way to convey it is with as much understatement as possible, because the facts of the story really do speak for themselves. And so I really tried not to have my voice in this book. I really wanted it to be told through the eyes of the Jewish and Palestinian characters.
Crossing characters and
yes.
Perspectives.
Now, the second part of your question of putting all of these things together, that was an enormous challenge, just a technical, structural challenge of how to keep a tight narrative around the crash, because if you veer too far away from that, a reader will lose patience. It really, if it's a book about this tragedy, it has to be a book about this tragedy, and you can only veer so far away before you come back to the event. At the same time, there are so many different people who are involved, and you cannot, a reader just cannot hold that many. Unlike, I was often jealous of film writers, when I was writing this book, because with a film, you see a boy once and he has a yellow, band on his wrist, and you just need to see that yellow band and you can remember him an hour later. You see a face, you can remember it. But with a book, it's very hard for people to keep in mind multiple characters and to have somebody who's pretty minor appear in one point and then appear 20 pages later, and who is this? And so with the structure of the book, I needed to make sure that when a person entered the story of the crash, they were entering really at the most important moment of the crash in terms of their own involvement in it, and that it was concentrated there, and that they didn't keep darting in and out of the story. So this character is going to appear now at this interval. At the same time, the ambition of the book was to tell the whole story of Israel-Palestine, and to do it through the family histories of these characters, or the personal histories of these characters. And there you have another timeline, which is not the 24 hours of the crash, but the whole 100-plus years of Israel-Palestine. And sometimes a character is actually most interesting, not so much for their involvement in the crash, but because of their backstory. Huda, who's at the center of the portion that I just read, her family story is the story of exile. And it's the story of being forced to flee Haifa in 1948, and her finally being able to come back to Palestine in the 90s because she happened to be married to a Palestinian diplomat, one of the few who was allowed to come back in the 90s during a limited window in Oslo. And so again, you're balancing this historical timeline. You can't talk about the second intifada before you've talked about the first intifada, and so it was a structural puzzle.
And it's very well done, if I can say that. Another thing that I guess it was very difficult to deal with is you construct the way you build the characters. You give not only the facts, but the intimacy of them. And they are real people. We must not forget that. They are real people. Do you have a limit for what to expose and what to tell, just to bring the light of the lives of this kind of people?
I think Abed wished I had a different limit than I had.
Abed.
No, I don't. I mean, I was very clear with everyone I spoke to that what I would use, and to tell me if there was something that I shouldn't. But no, as you see in the book, there's a whole story of a marriage unraveling in the most tragic way. There's stories of Abed's first loves and many intimate details of his family life and betrayals by members of his family who, in person, he still has not confronted to this day, who, if and when they read the book, will learn that he knows about this betrayal. And so, no, I felt that it was important to really make it as real as possible, to paint people in 3 dimensions, and to do that, I shouldn't have had any restraint.
And you give also the tensions, and the tensions, they are clear here, are not only the tensions between Israel and Palestine, but between them in families and in cities. The tensions are everywhere, and they are always dealing with the sense of guilt and the terror, and they could come from everywhere, and the traitors and everything. So that complexity that we we are not used to be to see so clearly narrated. Just tell us a little bit how did you decided to put that in that way so clearly?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, that is a core part of painting a real picture. You know, these people, for most of their life, they're interacting with one another. They're not interacting. They're living under a system of Israeli control, but they're living with one another, and their politics are with one another, and their, you know, marital relations are with one another, and their, you know, collaborators are within their society. And so all of that, you know, if you're going to present a real picture of a society, you have to show. And in Abed's case, you know, he has a relative who works for the Palestinian Authority, who works in the kind of security field for the Palestinian Authority, and this relative is a cousin. He actually happens to have been at the scene of the crash as part of his work. And Abed has very mixed feelings about the Palestinian Authority and about the fact of his cousin working for it. At the same time, he loves his cousin. And these people all understand the system that they're living in, and they have different justifications for it. His cousin has the most incredible political mind, and is very sophisticated and very witty, and he can defend what he's doing, and Abed can critique it. And all of that needs to be there.
Yeah. And we have a description about a backpack, a yellow backpack or something from a child. And also we have the description of the failure of diplomacy all over the years. These things between together gave us this complex portrait of what is that world in the days just before this fall. The book came out. The book was ready in August, I guess.
October 3rd. It was published 4 days before.
Yes, and it was ready 2 months before, but. Everything.
Oh, 4 days before.
4 days before.
Yeah.
So everything changed.
Yeah.
I guess what you thought that this book would be, or would be the reception of this book, transformed in 3 days. We have all this revolution. What was in your mind on that day, on those days?
Prior or after? Both.
It was 4 or 5 days, as you said. So everything changed, and the silent. I guess this conflict was silent with the conflict in Ukraine, and then the conflict was in the front pages everywhere.
Yes.
In a way that we never saw.
Yes. So, I mean, thinking about particular, I was told by various friends before the book came out, you know, your book is going to be a bellwether because U.S. public opinion has really shifted on Israel-Palestine, and especially among kind of center-left American Jews, opinion has shifted, especially among a younger generation. And so we're going to see with the reception of your book, we're going to see exactly how far things have moved, whether the mainstream accepts it, and so forth. And in those first few days after it was published, it felt like an affirmation of this person's positive prediction. And then when October 7th happened, I thought, you know, obviously what a disaster for everyone, what a disaster for Israelis, what a disaster for the people of Gaza. But I also thought, what a disaster for my book. And you know, it's been a totally polarized climate. I had multiple events canceled. I had ads that were running on the radio.
What were the arguments to cancel the?
It varied. An event in the UK was shut down by the UK police. It was at a time that week they were shutting down anything that had Palestinian in the title. So there was a traditional music festival, Palestinian, the night before. My event in London, that was at a church in London, was also shut down. The UK Home Secretary had, made some public statement that the police should consider arresting anyone with a Palestinian flag. The police didn't do it, but that was the atmosphere. And in the U.S., there was another event that it was a whole conference of Palestinians in Houston that was shut down, again by pro-Israel groups that pressured the Hilton Hotel that was hosting it to shut it down. But other events, it was organizations that were enthusiastic, had been enthusiastic about holding the event, felt like it was the right event for their audience, and then they were frightened. And they said, now's not the right time. Now, they know I live in Jerusalem, they know I'm here for only a month, and they weren't going to fly me out for one event. So anyway, the cancellations happened for many different reasons, but the main thing is that there is a real climate of fear. And even people are afraid to hold multiple truths in their minds at the same time. Even when I was saying after October 7th that Hamas committed war crimes and Israel, in collectively punishing 2 million innocent people in Gaza, is committing war crimes. Even this, you don't really have much company when you're saying that. And so yeah, that was the environment in reaction to the event after October 7th. But at the same time, I have to say, I really have no idea what is happening with global public opinion with respect to Israel-Palestine, because I see very contradictory things. And on the one hand, my personal experiences of all of these cancellations, and I see that the gatekeepers at, different media organizations are very afraid of touching the conflict in certain ways and touching my book in certain ways. At the same time, you see the largest Palestinian solidarity demonstrations that you've ever seen in the world. And on college campuses in the US, when I've gone and spoken there, the young people have told me they feel like there's never been more support for Palestinian rights. So I feel like there's a huge generational gap. And it's really unclear to me what the long-term and lasting effect of all of this war is going to be.
And you mentioned the polarization, and it seems to be almost impossible to have a conversation without somebody starting yelling, and the conversation. It's not possible. Do you think now it passed 2 months? 2 months since the conflict, we can start having a conversation about this?
Not yet.
Why?
I mean, my personal experience is there has been no shouting at any of the events that I've done, and even when I had events where people held it and were frightened to hold it and told me before, it was clear they didn't want to go ahead with the event, but they also didn't want to be one of those who's canceling. Even those events, everybody was grateful for it and everything went well. So clearly you can have these conversations, but I do feel like the prevailing atmosphere of fear and this notion, now is not the time, that's still the attitude right now, and it's going to have to wait until after there's a ceasefire or something of that nature, I think, before those people are ready to have conversations that they wanted to have prior to October 7th.
Do you believe that there will be before October 7 and after October 7, or the October 7? The October 7, it was just an extension of all that was happening, and this wall before and after, it's not really a thing.
So I'm of two minds about this. On one hand, of course, as your former prime minister said, October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. That's clearly true and obvious.
But that caused a great impact.
Yes. So it's absurd that was a scandalous statement that shows how little openness there is to any kind of a real conversation if that's a controversial statement. Of course it didn't happen in a vacuum. Of course there's a huge history. Of course there's a siege of Gaza. Of course there's a more than half-century long occupation. Of course 2/3 of the people in Gaza are refugees from 1948. That's all true. And I also think that this war and October 7th, the attack, are qualitatively different than what we have seen before. This isn't just another war in Gaza. I think it really is going to have a different kind of long-term effect. And I think that, for one thing, the Israeli public, for the first time that I've seen, is saying the system in place on October 6th was not working. That can't continue. That system included the notion that you would have to have periodic wars in Gaza. But those wars had very little price for ordinary Israelis. This has a huge price in all kinds of different ways for ordinary Israelis, even ones who don't personally have a loved one who was killed or taken hostage. So I think that that has a profound effect. The last several elections in Israel, the Palestinian issue was totally marginalized. It was barely a part of the election. The protests against the judicial reform in Israel, these were huge protests of a scale that you hadn't seen, I think, since the war in 1982 in Lebanon. And at those protests, they were defining themselves as democracy protests, protests to preserve Israeli democracy. And yet, the 5 million people, Palestinians living without basic civil rights under Israeli control, were totally absent from those protests. There was the most marginal group on the sidelines that was talking about the Palestinian issue and was saying, how can you even talk about this place being a democracy when half of the people here are Palestinian and most of them don't have basic civil rights? So that is all over. Now it's unimaginable that you would have a new set of anti-judicial reform protests that marginalizes the Palestinian issue. It's at the forefront of every Israeli's mind, and that creates opportunities. Whether they'll be, taken advantage of is another question.
And what is the main difficulty for a journalist that is reporting from that part of the world to show, because that part of the world is always in conflict, to be listened as I don't know, as a journalist, what is your challenge in that territory when you write about that?
There are so many. Part of what it means to write about this place is to live with a constant set of attacks, of litigation, of every single word that you write, what adjective you use, which source, why did you choose this source and not this source. There is an entire industry. There are groups whose sole mission is to get corrections from the major newspapers and magazines for stories related to Israel. Pro-Israel groups that all they do is complain to the New York Times about an op-ed or a piece that they've run and ask for a factual correction, not because they care only about facts, but because they know that if they present it as a factual correction, then the editors have to respond. They have a professional obligation. So when editors would commission pieces from me, they would tell me, this is going to take weeks of my life after it's published, because I'm just going to have to be litigating all of these complaints. So, like, it's a huge headache, and there is, as with so many aspects of this conflict, there is a huge imbalance in power. There isn't that industry for the Palestinians. There isn't this inundation of factual requests for corrections. They've failed. They haven't gotten a single correction out of me, but it's drained the life out of my editors. That's, you know, that's one aspect of it.
In being a Jew, people think that you are taking part.
Say that again?
Being a Jew,
Yeah.
People may think that you are taking part.
Definitely. All of the questioning of the identity of the writer, of the journalist, from every direction. And for many years, I did not ever answer any question about myself for that reason. I didn't want that to be part of the discussion, or the part of the means of delegitimizing something that I'd written. So when my first book came out, I didn't tell people about my life story or where my parents came from or that I was an American Jew or any of these things, because I didn't want that to be... First of all, I want to highlight the thing I'm actually writing about. But also, I just didn't want... I knew that it would be used to try and delegitimize. You know, he's writing this stuff about the life of suffering of Palestinians because he has mommy issues, you know, and whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your traumas, personal traumas.
Yes.
And you lived there for 12 years. What has changed in the daily life of Jerusalem in that period of time? Anything really changed, or in 12 years since?
I mean, so part of my work, I used to work for the International Crisis Group, and a lot of the work was briefing the local diplomats who would come in on tours of 3 or 4 years. And basically the pattern was the diplomat would arrive. They know absolutely nothing. And they want to have like a first meeting where you give them the ABCs. And I would always, dread these first meetings because you get nothing out of it and you do it over and over again. And by their third year, they know something and they actually give information back, and you learn some of what's happening in the EU discussion of whatever. And so in those first meetings, I would always disappoint these diplomats because they'd ask me what they should really read, and I would recommend books that were 20 or 30 years old. And I'd say, really, nothing's changed since then. Go read Meron Benvenisti's essays from, the early 80s. And they would say, you're killing me. You're telling me, nothing's changed. I came here hoping to make some change. And, I'm exaggerating. Things changed. There was a first intifada. There was the establishment of the PA. There was a second intifada. But if you're asking me about the last 15 years after the creation of the wall, since Abbas has been in power, with a division between Fatah and Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank, and with just slow, incremental Israeli absorption of the West Bank, that hasn't changed. It's really, that has been a static picture.
I don't want to make you a kind of visionary about the future, but what are your feelings about what's going to happen there?
It's kind of shocking to hear this, maybe, but because I felt so much of my despair about the future of this place was based on the fact that there was a huge discrepancy in power between the two sides, like a trillion to one. And the more powerful side was sitting very, very comfortably. They had no incentive to change. to alter the system that was working very, very well for them. Yes, there's some finger wagging from the outside world, but basically unobstructed. And after October 7th, I don't feel that's the case anymore. Now nobody feels like I'm sitting comfortably. And Israelis really are going to have to think of some other way to deal with the Palestinian issue. It might not be giving them an independent state. It might not be giving them equal rights, but they're going to have to find some kind of other arrangement. And I feel, in a way, that there's more chance now of seeing some kind of positive change in my lifetime than there was before October 7th.
You said in your lifetime, you are young. So you are going back to Israel?
I'm going back in a couple weeks, yeah.
And what's in your mind now?
On a personal level, you know, I think about how much sadness, anger, racism is in the air, and how I can shield my 3 daughters from that to the best of my ability. I worry about raising them in that environment. But that's, you know, home for them. They were born and raised there. I mean, the eldest was 6 weeks old when we moved there. Yeah, on the most basic level, I really think about what does it mean for them to be living now in this environment where they are going to be exposed to a lot of hatred and a lot of stereotyping and a lot of false and very one-sided narratives. And yeah, how do I shield them from that, and without, you know, imposing my own views, some kind of doctrine on them. Yeah.
Let's hear pass to the audience, open to the audience. I don't know if my okay. So first question from Sarah.
This is a question from the translator of the book.
Just
She knows
keep
the
your
book.
expectations low, because I'm just going to ask, how is Mr. Salama doing at this point?
So since October 7th, the first thing that happened was they shut down this walled enclave that he lives in. Everybody, you know, every family in the West Bank is dependent on jobs inside Israel and the settlements. That's much higher paying, and so extended families rely on that income. And those jobs basically don't exist now. Once they started to ease up the closure of Anata, the town that he lives in, it's still the situation with the jobs didn't change. His son has a job in Ramallah, and even his Palestinian employer told him, don't come to work. There's so much settler violence that it's unsafe for you to drive to your job in Ramallah. His wife's relative, her cousin's son, was shot and killed in Ramallah by the IDF about a month ago. There's a huge spike in violence from settlers and also from the army inside the West Bank right now. He has another person in the book, is Ruba, and she's Abed's sister-in-law, and she has a lot of family in Gaza, and a number of her relatives have been killed, and she's in a state of mourning. And the entire, environment in the West Bank is really, it feels like the Second Intifada. Ibrahim driving out of his house the other day had what appeared to be soldiers, but may have been settlers just in army uniform, shoot at his car, and then threaten him that if he were to report it, they knew where he lived and they'd come back. Abed, just yesterday, he was driving a taxi, and he was driving a group of people to near Nablus, and he passed a truck, and there was he says that it was a broken line, so it was legal for him to pass the truck, and as soon as he passed the truck, Israeli police in the West Bank, because it's Israeli police in the roads there, pulled him over and asked him to follow him to the entrance of the settlement of Ofra. And in this, they didn't enter the settlement, but they're just in front of the entrance gate. And there, the settlement guard came and drove up, and he had, a weapon with him, and he starts shouting at the policeman, "What are you doing bringing this Palestinian-plated car to the front of the settlement? I'll shoot Abed and all of the passengers of this car." And Abed is just sitting here, watching this confrontation between the settlement guard and the police officer, and he felt like his life was in danger. So that's what his life is now. Yeah.
Thank you. And really, from all I've heard of the book, from what you've read, it's so visual, and thank you for bringing and humanizing the experience of Palestinians. And I guess I wanted to ask if, because of the traumas experienced from those families affected by the accident, have you created a link between the traumas experienced there and the collective traumas of Palestinians and Israelis, Jews and Arabs over the years, from the Nakba to the Holocaust to the Farhud, etc., and if there's a link there? And also, I guess I have to ask, is there hope from trauma? We see sometimes the families of those who have been taken hostage speaking out, and is there, we're all looking for, if it's diasporic or whoever, we're all looking for hope. So just those questions, and thank you.
Thank you. Those old traumas were present in the minds and the memories of all of the people I talked to, including, as you mentioned, the Jewish characters who were talking about the Holocaust, or even going back to talking about pogroms and their grandparents moving to Palestine before there was a state of Israel. It was ever present. The Palestinians, of course, definitely connect the trauma of forced exile, the Nakba in 1948, to everything that they see happening today, because they see more and more forced displacement. They see it on a smaller scale in the West Bank. In days before October 7th, the UN issued a report saying that from the beginning of 2022 until September of this year, more than 1,000 Palestinians had been forcibly displaced in the West Bank, largely by settler militias, by the IDF and settler militias. And since October 7th, it's been an even greater number, another more than 1,000. So, talk about forced displacement. Now we have 1.8 million people in Gaza who have been forcibly displaced, and no Palestinian can talk about forced displacement at the hands of Israelis without talking about the Nakba. So I very much feel that those old traumas are with all of these people throughout their daily lives and their perception of current events. And in terms of hope, rabbis
for human rights and standing together, we hear you have to look to the good within all the disaster.
Yeah. To me, there are really important organizations who are doing great work on the ground and who are trying to make whatever small difference that they can. For the most part, these groups are pretty small and not, major forces in either society. But I do believe that it is very consequential that there is now a real motive to find some other kind of arrangement. And the one that is most obvious to Western policymakers, to the US, to the PLO, is establishing a Palestinian state. And that's really the only way that you can imagine getting to something that would approach a robust, lasting ceasefire. And every other option just looks like you're dooming yourself to more of this. So I do actually have some kind of hope that there would be more serious efforts in that regard, but if you were to ask me to bet on it, I would say it's not going to happen.
Sorry, could I? Yes. Can you hear me like this, or should I speak to the microphone? Okay, sorry. First of all, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the foundation for organizing this. Well, my question is that I'm a teacher, and for many years I've presented my students with the conflict. But a couple of years ago, I even asked my students to read Return to Haifa. And, the response is always, there's a lot of solidarity towards the Palestinians and the Palestinian people. And many times students come to me and they ask me, because they relate so much to the Palestinians, they ask me, so why do the Americans support so much the state of Israel? And I myself, because I think that I only come across things that, paint the state of Israel in a very negative light and that have a lot of solidarity towards the Palestinians. What I'd like to ask you is if you could perhaps try to explain to me so that I can also try to explain to my students why there is so much support from that older generation.
Yeah. It's a very big question. No, not at all. And I think that there are many ways to answer it. There's a kind of Cold War prism that you could answer it through. Israel is a close ally of the United States. The Soviet Union was allied with Arab states. There is a domestic politics component to it in the United States with very strong pro-Israel advocacy groups that are involved in not just high politics of presidential elections, but congressional politics. And there is a kind of generational change also in the U.S. where an older generation really viewed Israel as this David against the Goliath of the Arab world. And most younger people look at Israel as the Goliath against the Palestinians. Sorry if that's too short an answer.
That's great, thank you.
Okay. I was curious about your first book and that idea of the only language because I was listening to something today, a discussion on the conflict, and there was exactly this argument. So what Hamas understood was that the only way to move things forward, as you said, it opens a new horizon of hope, maybe, was through extreme violence. So I was trying to have your opinion on that relation between, the option of peace talks and peace agreements and everything failed completely.
Yeah.
So was it the only way?
My first book was called The Only Language They Understand, and it was about the history of Israeli territorial withdrawals, which were, every single one I document, was accompanied by either the threat of force or the use of force, economic coercion, diplomatic pressure. I show how each of those withdrawals came about through force. Similarly, on the Palestinian side, I show how the Palestinians didn't really have any tangible assets to concede, so they didn't have territory to withdraw from, but they had ideological concessions. They rejected the existence of the State of Israel, and they rejected the idea of there being some tiny Palestinian statelet within their historic homeland. And slowly, over time, through a great deal of force that was applied to them, they made ideological concessions that resulted in them accepting the idea of a Palestinian state on 22% of their homeland. And it's too early to say what October 7th is going to lead to. But I do believe that there at least is the possibility of new arrangements that weren't possible on October 6th. And I don't have much faith in the U.S. intervening in the kind of robust way that it would need to. But the U.S. does have the stated goal of achieving a two-state solution, of creating a Palestinian state. And if it were willing and intended to actually apply the tools that it has, I believe that it could help to create one out of this rubble.
Hi, and thank you for sharing and for holding this session. My question is about Israel and the public feeling of Israeli citizens towards their government. You mentioned the protests against the judiciary reform. We've also seen protests demanding the return of the hostages. So my question is, how long will it take until the government and Prime Minister Netanyahu are held liable for the security failure of October 7th? Because the war does kind of give them a pass because it's a greater priority for the moment. But
Yes.
How long can this last, and will eventually the public opinion turn on the government?
So although Netanyahu has survived in ways that no one expected, and really does seem to be a political magician of sorts, my view is that this is something he cannot survive. This is the greatest, one of the two greatest failures in the history of Israel. And there's just no denying that the Israeli security establishment failed in an enormous way, not just in intelligence and in prediction, but also in preparation, and then even after the event occurred, how poor the response was. And so it's clear to me that all the heads of the security establishment and military intelligence and the Shin Bet and all of them will be remembered as responsible for this and will lose their jobs. And and Netanyahu will be held responsible as well as the head of the government. And I agree with you that that's probably not going to happen while this intensive phase of this war is happening. It could happen maybe when you're in a, you know, if the ground invasion part of it is over and Israel, the war is still continuing, but in some kind of much lower flame way, it could happen then. It could happen after there's some sort of ceasefire. But I think it's going to happen.
Hi, my name is Summer Solomon, and I am a Palestinian American. First of all, I want to thank you for your presence here. I want to thank you for your creative courage in telling this story, and I'd really love to thank the people at FLAD for hosting this this tonight. My question, well, I have so many questions for you, Nathan, but the most burning question I would say is, as a Palestinian American who also carries a Hawiyya, a green identity card, I've traveled to Palestine before and I've seen kind of firsthand what life is like for Palestinians there. But my most burning question is in regards to the two-state solution. And I understand now that hostilities and things are too intense to even see a path forward, but do you even see any I can't miss the opportunity to ask you, based on your expertise and your knowledge in this, but do you see any even viable leadership on both Israel and the Palestinian side, on who could even hold those discussions or even imagine an opportunity for that to even exist moving forward from where we are now? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that if we were to enter this already fantastical realm where the U.S. is serious about exerting pressure to create a Palestinian state, that most likely it would have to be done by toppling this government. They would have to go over the heads of the government and speak to people who are now, they've formed a unity government with part of the opposition temporarily for the purpose of this war. But they would have to speak to basically the leaders of this center-left parties in Israel, who, in terms of their policies, when they're in power, don't really behave all that differently than this right-wing government, but nevertheless would be more open to the argument that the only thing that could plausibly result in this Gaza war not being just repeated every few years is the establishment of a Palestinian state with all kinds of security guarantees for Israel and the decommissioning of all of the militias and the integration into a Palestinian security forces and so forth. That would have to be done by talking directly to the leaders of those center-left parties and getting their acquiescence in advance, and also talking directly to the Israeli public and persuading them that this is really the only way that you can be assured that an October 7th is much, much less likely to happen. I mean, there's no guarantees of anything. And on the Palestinian side, Abbas has almost no legitimacy, but that's been the case also for years. And it has been the case that Hamas has said for years now, for many years, but including reiterated in a formal way in their 2017 policy document, they have said, we will accept two states if that is the position of the Palestinian national consensus. And so on the Palestinian side, I don't feel like it's an issue of you need to go over Abbas in the way you need to go over Netanyahu in order to just get the leaders to agree. Here on the Palestinian side, you do have an understanding that although there are very many different views of what the outcome should be, two states on the 67 borders is a national consensus. It's the bottom line that they all have agreed to, including Hamas, including the PLO. And so I don't feel like the legitimacy of the leadership is that critical as it is the issue on the Israeli side, where you just couldn't even get this government to agree to it under any circumstances because it collides with their ideology.
I don't understand how this conversation can continue without taking into account the role of Iran in the whole process. Because after all, I mean, Israel, I think it sort of represents a Western presence against Iran. I mean, Iran is furnishing drones to Russia. I mean, they're causing a lot of trouble. They have a lot of sort of satellite groups that cause trouble. I mean, doesn't the whole peace process has to involve Iran as well?
It's definitely the case that Iran has an influence over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Iran supports Islamic Jihad in a very direct way. They support Hamas. They support Hezbollah. But it has not been the view of any of the parties who have been negotiating this Israeli-Palestinian peace process since 1991 that you need Iranian acquiescence in an agreement that if the PLO and Hamas both agreed to outcome X, that Iran would veto it. That hasn't been the Israeli view, that hasn't been the Palestinian view, that hasn't been the American view. I definitely agree with the premise of your question that Iran is a major influence on this conflict, and the fact that there is this, Cold War between, or hot war, I guess, in some instances, between Israel and Iran, it is definitely an important factor, and it would make it much easier to achieve an agreement if that didn't exist. But I don't see it as a central obstacle to an Israeli-Palestinian agreement.
But I mean, isn't Saudi Arabia on the verge of normalizing relations with Israel?
Yeah.
Which would be a problem for Iran. There was also the talk some time ago that Hamas and other groups related to Iran had a meeting in Tehran shortly before the October 7th attack occurred, giving the impression that in fact either Iran was instigating the attack or the groups had to ask for permission to carry out the attack.
So all of the reporting that's been out there about this has indicated that Iran had no foreknowledge of the attack, and in fact, even Israeli officials have said that they have come to that conclusion as well. Saudi normalization, there's been a lot of talk about it, and it may occur, and Iran would rather that it not occur, but I don't see that as an obstacle to an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. The real obstacles to Israeli-Palestinian agreement are the Israelis and the Palestinians. If the two of them came to an agreement with the acquiescence of the major Palestinian political parties, I don't see Iran going against the Palestinian national consensus and trying to blow up an agreement. And I frankly don't know that they could succeed if they tried.
No more questions? So I have to thank you, Nathan, for being here, And I guess Nathan will be happy to sign your books over there. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.